It's nice to be here, though I must confess, thanks to the altitude, I'm a little lightheaded, so if any of you have some extra red blood cells you can spare, send them my way. So as Joss mentioned, this talk grew out of an exhibition I curated about 8 or 9 years ago at the National Building Museum, which is one of the largest private museums in Washington, D.C. It's not part of the Smithsonian. It occupies a spectacular 19th century building that was actually originally built as headquarters of the Pension Bureau. You see here a photo of the Great Hall of the building, which is roughly the size of a football field and 159 feet tall at its highest point inside. So really one of the I think, favorite spaces of many local Washingtonians. The Building Museum is interesting because of its mission, which is to cover all aspects of what we call the built environment. So that includes architecture, engineering, construction, landscape architecture, historic preservation, infrastructure, all of these kinds of things, which I think is vital for how this exhibition came to be, because it does actually span many of those different disciplines, and I'm not sure any other museum could ever have quite taken it on, quite frankly. So I suppose you could say the thesis of this exhibition is that the three cities that were built practically overnight during World War II for the Manhattan Project, obviously Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Richland/Hanford, Washington, and Los Alamos, simultaneously reflected and redirected and accelerated some major changes that were going on in terms of how people understood and interpreted the design of cities, the design of buildings, in particular domestic architecture and community planning. And so none of these cities kind of came out of the blue in terms of the thinking about what was going to go on there, even though they did kind of come out of the blue physically because they were built so quickly. And so I'm going to trace a little bit of the background of some of the influences on the secret cities, and then ultimately bring this together in terms of their impact on post-war assumptions about how people should live in this country. The idea of a planned community was nothing new. Washington, D.C., after all, was a planned city going back to the 1790s with Pierre Charles L'Enfant. But typically in American city planning, rather, from most of the country's history, cities were very rational things. They were gridded. They were logical. You had avenues and streets. There was a very business-like approach to that. Now, the Americans didn't invent that. The ancient Greeks had gridded cities, so there was nothing new about that. But it was very much, I would say, the quintessential American idea about how you create communities. So as cities were growing and becoming dirtier, frankly, with the Industrial Revolution, they were becoming more chaotic. There was a real movement in the mid-19th century to try to find ways to get people out of that scenario. And so that began the planned garden community movement. And the first, what's widely regarded as the first planned suburban community in the United States, Riverside, Illinois, that was brought to us by Calvert and Vaux. If those names sound familiar, they were the people who gave us New York's Central Park. But here you see a very kind of organic pastoral design. What you can't tell from this drawing is that the layout of those streets followed the topography of the site. Now, this was obviously meant to be a peripheral community. There was a train line there that ran into Chicago, about 10 miles to the east. So the expectation was that people living in this community would be walking once they got there. This was obviously well before the automobile. So that was kind of if you will, almost a platonic idea that was out there of this perfect little garden community that would be the home base where people would live, they'd raise their kids before going on into the city to do their work. And that movement continued to percolate a while. Later in the 19th century, we had in England a visionary planner named Sir Ebenezer Howard, who specifically developed what he called the Garden City. And here, a bit more of that rational idea coming through. As you can see, not a grid, but in this case, a very geometric notion of the central city with these satellite communities. Now, at this point, remember, the car is barely on the horizon at this point. So now we're beginning to think of ways in which people might be able to get between these cities and between these communities and the main city, and that perhaps those little communities on their own would be more comprehensive. They would include places to shop, et cetera, rather than just for places for people to sleep. And some of these were kind of executed in one way or another. Letchworth was a town that you see here at lower right that had this wonderful main plaza, a very orderly kind of town square, but with these much more organic communities for residential buildings outside of that. In our own country, back in the early 20th century, again, the idea of wartime housing for war workers, defense workers, that was also not new in World War II. And during World War I, as you can see from the date, really kind of at the end of World War I, America's involvement wasn't so drawn out for World War I. There was an effort on the part of the federal government to create good, efficient and affordable housing for defense workers. This idea coming into play that in order to do their jobs well, they needed to be well housed. That wasn't quite so clearly articulated at that point, but they knew they had a lot of people coming to these production centers and there weren't places for them to live. But here on the left, you'll see a diagram that probably reminds you a good bit of the freeform streets and neighborhoods that we saw in Riverside, but with clearly a great deal more architectural ambition. You can see here in the upper right a kind of a community center, which actually there is at lower left in the drawing on the left. There was an ambition about creating real communities that would survive after the war and be places where people would still want to live. So this idea of bringing together the exigencies of wartime housing production with the idea of creating a new way for people to live after the war. Now, the reality of some of this stuff that was actually built rather hastily towards the end of the war wasn't always matching that ambition. Here you see an example of a U.S. Housing Corporation development from Waterbury, Connecticut, still with the dirt road. Perfectly fine houses, but not particularly ambitious. This was a much more kind of quick process, as we didn't really know that the war was going to be ending yet, so they were trying to produce housing as quickly as possible. But that said, in Washington, D.C., there were some larger developments that were built at that time, since demolished. You'll see over on the left, if any of you know, let's do it this way, if any of you know Washington, D.C., that's Union Station. So right across from Union Station was a campus-like development of multifamily housing for defense workers. And these were actually constructed, kind of a neo-colonial design, but again, a certain degree of architectural ambition. Interestingly, you would expect that they would be thinking that would hang on, that having gone to all that trouble, but in fact they didn't make it. They were demolished after the war. But some other sites in D.C., if any of you know the National Bureau of Standards site, this is now what we jokingly call Embassy Acres in northwest Washington, D.C., off of Connecticut Avenue, and here at the Navy Yard. Those were not executed, but it shows you the fact that they were really thinking broadly about defense housing and particularly in D.C. as the center of government and military. Now, moving ahead until we're getting well into the automobile age, there was a rethinking of this a bit, recognizing that the automobile was part of this. And so in this plan for Radburn, New Jersey, Stein and Wright, two landscape architects and planners, came up with their own version of this, still kind of the fluid planning, but their key idea was to create a community that was walkable, even though people would need cars to move around within it and to move from there to the main city. So there was a real emphasis on creating kind of two layers of connectivity, one for cars and one for people. So it was quite common in this town, it is quite common in this town to see these walking paths with roadways going over it. So this kind of hybrid idea about what form these new suburban communities might take in the automobile era. And during the New Deal, the 1930s of the continuing depression, famously the federal government did build a number of towns from scratch, in particularly the three green towns, one in Maryland, Greenbelt outside of DC, there was also one in Ohio, one in Wisconsin. And you can see some of the similar attitudes here, very rational and yet kind of organic radial pattern at the same time, but a real emphasis on shared communal space, a town center, et cetera. So very forward-looking in many respects, but still creating a walkable community that was the sort of place where people could gather and really feel a sense of identity that was distinct to that community and not just being part of the larger whole of Washington, D.C. Now, the dark side of this is that all three of these were sundown towns. If you don't know that term, that meant that if you were black, you could not be in the town after sundown, which obviously meant you couldn't live there either. So these towns actually institutionalized the segregationist policies that were just kind of assumed as being the norm at the time. So another thread that comes into the development of the secret cities was how to build for these new communities so quickly. And we talk a lot about prefabrication and some of the new technologies that were coming into play in the development of Oak Ridge, Richland, and Los Alamos. But again, this was nothing new. In fact, 3/4 of a century before that, here we have a plan for, it's a little hard to read here, but it's the Portable House Manufactory, which was proposing this series of buildings that could be put on a ship from England and taken all the way over to Australia and being erected in the outback. So that technology existed even at that time, kind of at the height of the Industrial Revolution. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Sears house. This was a kit house that was very popular throughout the United States in the early 20th century. Sears was not the only company doing this. There were quite a few other companies as well. Aladdin Homes was a major one. And as you may know, you would get a catalog. You would go through, just find the design that you liked, in this case, the sunshine, and you would choose that design, put in an order, and all of the material would come to you pre-cut. This wasn't true prefabrication because you were still getting pieces. It was like getting a Lego kit. But all of the lumber was pre-cut to the right size. All of the pieces of equipment or pieces of building material you needed were there, but you would hire a contractor who would build the foundation and then build this after the whole collection of stuff arrived by truck or by train to your site. Now, as we got into the Depression era, there was a good deal more experimentation, some of which was around kind of around the various World's Fairs that took place during the 1930s. This was a real concerted effort on the part of government and industry both to, first of all, to try to find a way out of the Depression, trying to do it through innovation, and also, frankly, to try to make people a little bit more optimistic towards the future. And so, although this didn't directly grow out of one of those, I think it was very much part of that ethos of the era. This was the American moto home, not motor home. I never could figure out in all my research why it was called that, because it's not meant to be moved around in this case. But quite innovative and obviously much more modern in appearance. In this case, the primary structure was for the walls was cement asbestos panels, which alarms a lot of people now. Those kinds of panels actually existed in various forms. We'll talk about some more a little bit later on. The asbestos was really sort of embedded with the cement, so it wasn't flying around in the air. I've found no evidence of any significant health hazards from being around these panels. I don't think you'd want to go hacking into them with a saw without a mask on. But still, those panels were held in place with relatively heavy gauge steel. My favorite aspect about this particular model, though, was that the idea was that this would come to you in a kit, much like the Sears house or the Aladdin homes, but this was really meant to be something that would help create instant communities for people who were displaced, who were moving because of economic circumstances or whatever it might be. And you can see it's not a tiny house, but it would come not only with all of the stuff you need for the building, but also with all of the furniture and with all of the food in the kitchen pantry. So you would be ready to roll. This is a turnkey operation. Didn't actually take off. But obviously things that are a little bit more familiar to us, we're all familiar with trailers, manufactured housing, things that still exist today. But the government was kind of at the forefront of some of that in the New Deal era as well. Again, they faced the challenge of housing workers. A lot of the New Deal programs, as I'm sure you know, involved bringing huge numbers of workers to places where they could be employed, to be engaged in a variety of things. Over 40,000 schools were built in the United States by New Deal agencies. Over 40,000. Over 3 billion trees were planted by New Deal agencies. And of course, famously, we had the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, where they were harnessing the hydroelectric power of the Tennessee Valley, and these workers needed places to stay, so the government brought in these temporary, in this case, a double trailer. But even here, I think it's interesting that you can see that there's a little bit of architectural ambition. I mean, we tend to think of trailers as rudimentary things, and we'll see some examples of that a little bit later on, but really kind of a bay window there at the one end with an overhang to protect it from harsh sun. There was thought going into these things. So even in these rudimentary dwellings that were kind of disdained by other people, there was a level of design quality that should not be overlooked. And then famously, saw one coming in again tonight, the Quonset hut. Few people think about this, a very, very kind of, just serviceable building just to create space. but it was designed by an architect, a guy named Otto Brandenburger, who brought architectural skills to figuring out what is the ideal amount of space you can get for the least amount of material, how quickly can it be built, how can it be transported efficiently, and this was actually inspired by a pre-existing model that had been developed in Britain called the Nissen hut. A lot of people like to think Quonset hut, so named because it was first installed at Quonset Point, Rhode Island. They think of it as a very American thing. We actually kind of stole it from the Brits, but it's a slightly different version. And by the end of World War II, over 150,000 of these had been deployed all over, particularly in the Pacific Theater, to house troops, supplies, all sorts of things along those lines. And it wasn't just in this very practical realm that there was a lot going on in terms of new ideas about housing. Very much even at the kind of at the upper echelons of academia, the Bauhaus era. If you're familiar with the famous Bauhaus school in Germany, that was a leader in kind of establishing new ideas about modern architecture during the Weimar Republic of Germany. These were some of the greatest thinkers of the era. Walter Gropius, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, and they had an opportunity to show their stuff at a series of housing displays. Siedlung is German for kind of a housing exposition. This one in Weissenhof, outside of Stuttgart. You see here, I mean, this was kind of a who's who of this. I'm not sure I can point them all out. The biggest one, the long building here, that was by Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, but you also had Le Corbusier. A lot of the big names of the era were trying to offer their ideas for decent housing. And this was very socially driven. It was very socialist driven. It was, the Nazis were, they were persecuting the people at the Bauhaus and they were calling them communists and socialists. That was not inaccurate. It was very much tied into the socialist movement of providing decent housing for people of all walks of life. And it wasn't elaborate. They weren't expecting that these were going to be lavish houses, but the idea is that it would be clean, serviceable, spacious, and adequate to support families of all different income levels. So also during that era, we had, again, back more on the practical side, kind of a new version of the kit house going, now a quarter of a century later or more. This is one that was called the build cost gardened home. I loved that term. And here for $5, you could send off for a complete set of drawings that would tell you exactly what you need in order to build this house. And again, in this case, you would hire a contractor who would actually do it, but it was everything, the entire list of every item needed. You weren't actually getting the kit, but it was a variation on the theme for people who didn't want just to have the kit delivered. The key interesting thing about this, though, is that this design was prepared by two architects by the name of Louis Skidmore and Nathaniel Owings, who went by Nat. And they're going to figure very prominently into our story as we go a little bit further. Their firm, which eventually added a third partner named John Merrill, became Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, SOM for short. And they got their start, Skidmore and Owings did, in the 1933-1934 World's Fair in Chicago, where they were invited to do some of the pavilions there, some of the planning. And if you think about it, a World's Fair is kind of one of these instant cities. It's really doing a lot of different things at the same time, bringing different kinds of building types together, different kinds of people, different kinds of ways for people to move about. So I don't think it's an accident that this is where they got their start and how they ended up with doing what they will do, as we'll see in a moment. And they actually did pretty well throughout the 1930s in the midst of the Depression. By the end of the 30s, they had, depending upon which source you believe, between 60 and 90 employees, which for an architecture firm of that era, pretty good size. They continued to get commissions for the 1939 World's Fair, 1939-1940. In this case, the Venezuela Pavilion. Hard to see in this image, but this beautiful kind of rendition of the classic Latin American murals that we now associate with with Mexico in particular, but many other Latin American countries. On the underside of this great canopy, a very dynamic, very modern, but very evocative form. So at the same time, Skidmore, Owings, and then Merrill were doing some interesting work with a group called the John B. Pierce Foundation, which was a very forward-looking organization, a nonprofit that was dedicated to, again, in the Depression era, finding and helping to develop new ways of building, new technologies, very much with an idea towards improving people's lives. It wasn't just for the sake of it, this is a cool new thing, let's try it. They wanted to create affordable, good, decent housing, easily maintained, that would allow people to build houses for the many people who were famously, as Franklin Delano Roosevelt, ill-housed at the time of the Great Depression. And so one of the elements that they kind of came across in this process was this new a way of building. Cemesto, again, cement asbestos, it's a kind of a portmanteau word, put together by the Celotex Corporation. And in this drawing, you see on the left a kind of a typical wood frame construction house. There's actually lots of parts. We think of that as being a very simple way of building a dwelling, but you've got lots of individual pieces there that go into creating that wall. Well, with Cemesto, that was it. Basically a sandwich panel of this cement asbestos board, a horizontal element which would allow the panels to be put together, and a simple wood column, and that was it. Now you can imagine that had its limitations in terms of insulation capacity, et cetera, but there's some insulation built in there. And the key thing was that it was a new way to build very quickly and solidly. And the Celotex Corporation very much sold this as something that could help us win what at this point in 1941 they knew was the impending war. But even before Pearl Harbor, people could see the writing on the wall. And so they put together this great brochure talking about how, folks, we need to set aside what we've been talking about in terms of housing the masses. We now have a new priority, which is housing the defense industry, the huge numbers of defense workers that we know are going to be needed in order to win this war that many of us believe we're going to be involved in. Now, the brochure had some interesting approaches. The vital to the nerves and sinews of defense. Here on the left, we see some of the sinews. We see the shirtless man lovingly caressing the missile there. We see the woman in a lovely going-out blouse with an ample bosom and a tiny waist making little munitions. So it was very deliberate, an effort to promote this idea of strength, of kind of the American way and how all of this was going to help us win the war. And we would win it through building. It wasn't just winning it through ammunition. It wasn't just winning it through military strategy, but we were going to house all of these people, and we were going to find a way to do it cheaply and quickly. And so the Cemesto houses, the first place where they were deployed was in a town called Middle River, in Maryland, not far from DC and Baltimore. But this was the bedroom community right next to the Glenn L. Martin aircraft factory. And if that name sounds familiar, Glenn L. Martin, Martin Marietta, Lockheed Martin. So this was one of the places that was really gearing up for, again, in 1941, a lot of people knew what was coming. And so advertising here, 35 man-hours to build all the walls and roof for one house. That was extraordinary. And this was actually something that was implemented there. We see some examples here that one of the communities that was built, remarkably kind of still preserving some of the large trees on the site. Middle River is very interesting. It has, the streets in the plan are like Fuselage Lane and my favorite left wing lane and right wing lane. I don't know if there was any self-separation there. But one of the other great, and I think fascinating aspects of this, look at this line here. Celotex Cemesto homes are individually distinctive. And this is an idea I'm going to come back to a number of times as we go forward. In a time of pending crisis, it was believed by the people who were putting together these communities that we still needed to express individuality in these dwellings for huge numbers of workers. And this was done by allowing different colors, different treatments, different materials. They would have different colors of roof, et cetera. So you could actually find your house among this street of identical houses, and that was something that was considered to be quite important. So the way Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill comes back into this is having done the work with John B. Pierce Foundation, having executed the projects at Middle River, they attracted the attention of Leslie Groves and the people behind the Manhattan Project, as it was not yet officially known. Well, never really officially had that name until long after. And so One day in 1942, according to Nathaniel Owing's biography, two gentlemen in plain clothes came into the SOM office in New York. And imagine, as I said, they were doing pretty well, but this was still the tail end of the Depression, and it was a struggling period for many architecture firms. And these guys sat down with the principals and said, "We would like you to design a town for 13,000 people." So Nat Owing said, and they said, "Do you think you can do that?" And Nat Owing's, like any good architect trying to get a project, said, "Sure, no problem." Even though he had absolutely no idea how this firm of 60 to 90 people was going to accomplish that, because they had typically been doing these things at a much more modest scale. And so they were informed also by the two visitors in plain clothes that they would not be given any information about the site, including topographical drawings, its location, etc., and they were supposed to design the entire town. So Owings pointed out that that was quite simply impossible. One of the things about designing a town and designing houses that you need to know how the utilities get there, how people get there, roadworks, etc. So they finally agreed that they would send John Merrill to the site. So he showed up at Penn Station not knowing where he was going, and when he got there, he was handed an envelope, top secret, that informed him he was going to Knoxville, Tennessee, which was the closest site to what would become Oak Ridge, initially known as the Clinton Engineer Works because of the nearby town of Clinton. And I'm sorry it's impossible to read at this scale, but this is a sample eviction notice that was given to the roughly 1,000 people within the 50-some-odd thousand acres of the site that would become Oak Ridge. They were given 10 days to get out because they were told that this was going to be turned into a demolition range. Pretty clever, actually. If you want to get rid of people, tell them that things are going to start blowing up. So in many cases, families that had been there for generations were given 10 days to leave. And so SOM started its work very quickly, and I find this really astonishing because here, this is a little sort of a blow-up. Once they got to the site, they found out what the topography was, et cetera. Oak Ridge, it implies that there was actually a lot of topography there, probably more accurately called Oak Ridges. One of the reasons that Groves was interested in it was that the multiple ridges and valleys provided some protection for the multiple production facilities that would be going on for the uranium enrichment. His notion was that we don't know which uranium enrichment process is going to be most effective, so we're going to build all of them. And we want to have some protection in the event of a leak, an explosion, or even they worried about the possibility of German planes getting that far inland. And their thought was that if they were in different valleys, it would be harder for warplanes to bomb multiple facilities all at one time. So what we see here is SOM's plan for the working part of the city. The actual production facilities were kind of off to the west and the south there. But what is extraordinary about this is they have placed every single house. So here was a firm that was just doing individual pavilions, little houses, and a couple of street plans, and they have designed this entire city, figuring out how all of these things are going to work together, and very much inspired by some of those Garden City ideals. The expectation was that this would absolutely be a car-oriented community at that point, certainly, but they were trying to create little areas within that would be little nodes where you'd have some degree of walkability. There'd be a shop at the center of that node, a school, et cetera. So there would be some walkability, even though for the most part people would be having to rely on cars for much of their transportation. And much like the houses in Middle River, the Semestos were initially pretty simple. The A house here, they were named just different letters for different models as we go through. This is an early version. You see not much landscaping around it with the simplest one. There were a variety of them. This is a D house, much larger. But what's already striking to me about this is now just a little bit later on during the process. Look at the trees. Again, I'm just astonished that in this time of now they really think they're fighting to preserve Western civilization. And one of the key ideas, I think it's fascinating to me in seeing the sculpture out front, perhaps the oddest non-romantic couple of all time, Leslie Groves and Robert Oppenheimer, essentially agreeing ultimately on the idea that in order to bring the country's most eminent scientists and engineers here to give up their lives, often cushy positions in universities, et cetera, and get them to come here and do work effectively, we need to house them comfortably. It doesn't need to be lavish, but we need to have a sense of community. And here, the effort to leave those mature trees while putting in this house during a time of national crisis. At one point during, I think this was during 1944, the semestos were being completed at a rate of 1 every 30 minutes. And as they're doing this, they're still keeping an eye towards how to create that community, how to create a sense of quality. It's also interesting to me that these were not necessarily assigned so that larger houses went to the most senior people. It was largely based on how big your family was. And obviously the people who were high up, they were all going to get decent housing, but and the lower level workers, as we'll see, typically did not. But it was actually kind of remarkably socialistic again, this idea that it was based on your need rather than your status. So these were assigned for the most part based on how big their family was and other kinds of criteria. Unfortunately, that 13,000 figure that SOM was given, that went out the window very quickly. It turned out to be 20,000, 30,000, 45,000, and by the end of the war, Oak Ridge had 75,000 people. So even with all this effort, SOM could not possibly keep up with all of these semesto houses, which again were not prefabricated, but were kind of kit houses. So they were done very quickly, but now they needed to bring in some other ways to house people even more quickly. So this is one example, the so-called flat tops. The origin of the term is pretty obvious, awkwardly cited in this case, but again, kind of going back to that TVA trailer, a little bit of architectural ambition, the setbacks, the kind of sleek windows there, but this was true prefabricated housing. And here you see dramatically how prefabricated it was. These came in 2 pieces on trucks from Indiana, 24 feet by 24 feet for the final house, and you can see that not only did it come with furniture, but it wasn't food in the pantry, but the curtains were already installed too. So these could go up remarkably quickly. And I keep coming back to this idea of just how extraordinary this was. In this time of crisis, I think people accurately viewed it potentially as a moment of existential crisis for Western civilization, for the United States, for the ideas for which we stood. I don't think most other countries would have done it that way. And this is an example of that fact that they weren't thinking along those lines. You can see the date, Ernst Neufert, you can see the language. This was a German proposal for creating defense worker housing using, in effect, an enormous machine for building multifamily housing. And these are rails so that the machine would move on the rails and kind of stamp out another set of apartments every few days. And this was that idea of how you would accommodate people in such large numbers so quickly. And to me, this gets at the heart of what I find many Americans, many Europeans and many people from elsewhere in the world find astonishing when they come and visit people in the United States, and not just going to the big places like New York and Miami and so on, but seeing the real country. They tend to be astonished by the extent to which it is a single-family house-focused society. That is not so common in most parts of the world. Most people tend to live in multifamily dwellings, and for a variety of reasons. It's just their assumption of what makes sense, what a typical community is. But this is so ingrained in American culture. And going back, we can argue about where that comes from, the idea of rugged individualism, the great frontier, who knows? But this showed up constantly in the work that was being done. Now that said, as the work in Oak Ridge continued, SOM realized, look, we need to do some multifamily housing as well. So they started creating some apartment buildings. But even here, compare this to, I don't want to go backwards, but think of Neufert with this very rationalist machine stamping out just another bay after bay of this long building. Here, you see freshly after they were built, so not much landscaping, but some of the apartments, so-called Broadway Avenue apartments, which had some architectural character once again. I mean, this porch with the wood siding, the kind of quaint little casement windows with the subdivisions and so on, there was a real hominess to this. So throughout, and even when it continued and they needed more multifamily housing even more quickly, we got to dormitories, very plain certainly, and yet composed very carefully in kind of a college campus-like environment. And here, again, keeping some of the large trees. And there were a lot of great photos of people inside their dorm rooms that they had made very homey. And one thing that struck me in doing the research for this exhibition was interview after interview with people both on tape, on film, and in print, talking about growing up as children in Oak Ridge during the war or after the war, when it was still a fenced-in community, and how great a place it was to grow up. In a community that was built under crisis conditions almost overnight, and with a military, kind of a military oversight, to think that this was such a great place to grow up. So even when they resorted to the trailers that they had tried to avoid, you see here, I mean, talk about no nonsense, the number stamped on there and even some scribbling here. But I'm fascinated by just the human impulse to create a sense of home. And this woman who had added this trellis, almost the size of the trailer itself with the awning, it's something that just spoke to me time and time again about how people went about creating community in these extraordinary circumstances. And SOM, perhaps drawing now from Radford, New Jersey, trying to create pedestrian-friendly places, park-like spaces, again, during a crisis, during a wartime operation for the Army, saying, oh, we need parks. We need recreational places. We need places for people to enjoy the outdoors. People also needed places to shop. This is what's so-called Town Site Shopping Center, which still is there and looks almost exactly the same. It's now called Jackson Square, but I put up this photo because one of the other things that's fascinating, which ties into one of the points I'll make towards the end, SOM, when they took on this project and said, look, we're going to be designing everything. It's not just a question of designing housing. We're designing an entire community. People need places to shop, to go to church, whatever it might be. And well, how do you do that? That's not something that had been done before. And the approach that they had was, or we're going to solve this. We're problem solvers. People think of architects as the people who do the nice sketch on the napkin and wear funky eyewear. But in fact, architects are problem solvers all the time on a daily basis, figuring out how you're bringing together structural, technical aspects and ventilation and building codes and all these things. And so their approach was actually quite clever. They were sitting in a meeting, and this was in the early stages when they thought they were designing for 13,000 people. And Lewis Skidmore said, my hometown, Lawrenceburg, Indiana, it's about 13,000 people. Let's send some people out there and do some data-driven research. We're going to find out how many barber chairs there are in this town for 13,000 people, how many beauty parlor chairs, how many pharmacies, and how many square feet total. So they created these spreadsheets. These architects, who are supposed to be designers, they created spreadsheets and through direct data collection, figured out how many of all of these things they needed to put in their new artificial town. And they did so. And I never heard anyone complaining about there being a lack of pharmacies or grocery stores or whatever, because they had really put in the work to figure out what was needed for that. And here you see in the background there a mural of that townsite shopping center. And I just add this kind of ending the section on Oak Ridge, the reminder that these were communities kind of brought together by crisis, but people still needed to live. They needed to express themselves creatively. Here we have the rhythm engineers who are performing on stage. And I'll also make a point here, just you'll notice the photo credit at the bottom, Ed Westcott. In this presentation, the Oak Ridge section is by far the biggest, and there are several reasons for that. It was the biggest of the three secret cities. From the standpoint of my research and the thesis that I mentioned at the beginning, it was the most significant. It had the greatest impact. But also, they had Ed Westcott, a remarkably talented photographer who was given access to lots and lots of things. And so in Oak Ridge, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of photographs available, far fewer in Hanford / Richland and in Los Alamos. So Oak Ridge gets the lion's share of the coverage here. I'm also talking less about Los Alamos under the presumption that all of you are very familiar with it. But I did want to make that point as to why Oak Ridge gets more than its share. Unfortunately, all of these ideas about creating good communities, ideal communities, very forward-looking in many respects, the reality was that didn't apply to everybody. In that initial scheme, if you remember the plan that SOM had done for the whole linear city, the easternmost part was initially going to be the, quote, Negro village, end quote. And interestingly, the idea was that they would be occupying the same kinds of houses as all of the white people would be. They would still be in semestos and the flat tops. So there was no difference in housing quality. It was it was going to be a separate but equal situation. But the reality is, as the population burgeoned, as they were designing and more people needed to be accommodated, all of that ended up being devoted to white people. And so the black residents of Oak Ridge were relegated to what came to be known as hutments. And there were huge communities, thousands of people living in these hutment communities. And what you see is what you get. That's it. That's plywood. That was your house. That was all it was. The people in these communities were segregated by sex, even if they were married. And they were subjected to much greater surveillance than people in the white communities were. And they were notoriously freezing in the winter and broiling in the summer. So despite the fact that SOM had initially tried to push the envelope a little bit, saying, all right, we're accommodating, this was the South during the 1940s, we realized we're going to have to do it as separate, we want it to be equal, but the reality was that was not achieved in Oak Ridge. So in Hanford/Richland, a very different landscape, but with certain similarities, that there were people there, in this case predominantly the indigenous tribes, the Wanapum people, whose name meant people of the river, or river people, with a very interesting indigenous architecture, these great long reed huts there. And one of the great ironies of Native American history, the Wanapum people had actually always enjoyed remarkably comfortable relationships, friendly relationships with the white settlers. And so they never signed a treaty with the United States. And so when the US came in and said, we're taking all your land and you can't use your sacred river for fishing anymore, they had no recourse. So they were summarily moved out. And what initially took their place was this extraordinary development, this was the prelude. This wasn't the end result. This is just what was needed in order to get everything else built. This was the construction camp where they were bringing the workers who would be building the facilities where they would be creating plutonium, as well as the residential communities in Richland, which was an existing town where the Army came in and just evicted everybody. It was a smaller town at that point. I don't know if any of you have ever been to the Hanford area. It's a very haunting landscape. It's beautiful, but it's creepy. And here, whereas the protection for this process in Oak Ridge was all of those ridges and valleys that would allow for protection in the event of an explosion or whatever, here it was sheer space. The entire area appropriated by the government in Hanford/Richland was, if I remember correctly, 670 square miles, which is more than half the size of Rhode Island. So the idea here was simply that you were just going to put a lot of space in between these things, and that was the level of protection. So for the workers, it was much more like a traditional military camp. These were builders, these were manual laborers who were coming to build everything else. But at its peak, this community housed 50,000 people, making it the fourth largest city in the state of Washington. But you can see here from this site diagram, Hanford, the stuff where all the work was going on was well isolated from Richland. Unlike in Oak Ridge, where they were pretty close together, this is where everybody lived, and that's where all the nasty stuff was happening. And to this day, if you visit Richland and you drive up, it's kind of a lot of nothing, and then you start to see these little buildings appear on the horizon, and then it's a really big nuclear reactor, and then you go and it disappears, and another one appears on the horizon. But very flat, but then with this rise, a kind of an escarpment on the right side there along the Columbia River, which is actually quite beautiful. So here, once again, it wasn't SOM, but another firm, in this case a Spokane-based firm led by a Swedish-American architect named G. Albin Pearson, who took the lead on the community design. And again, just remarkably, you see here an aerial view of one of the new communities being built, and you'll notice in particular all of the individual houses, once again, single-family houses, but you notice the arrangement, they're not just all lined up in the traditional fashion. And that's because he cited each one to take advantage of views. So here in the middle of this crisis, we're worried about the views of the people living in these houses. I just, every time I think about it, it astonishes me even more that this was considered to be something that was necessary to create the kind of community where people could do the difficult work that they would be doing. There's no control of this experiment, so we actually obviously have no idea what would have happened if they were housed in just, that Ernst Neufert sort of stamped building. But, it was a success, and how much of that was because they created communities where people actually wanted to live. And once again, Pearson came along, very different style from what SOM was doing in Oak Ridge, but creating, these look like normal American houses. And he insisted at every turn that these be built with a great degree of quality. He insisted on Douglas fir, very high quality wood. You see here the lap shingles, really a nice little house. Not elaborate, but well composed and simple, and certainly very decent. Other variations, once again, the huge mature trees preserved in the building. I mean, half the time you see a new community being built now and they can't manage to preserve the trees. But here they were going to all that effort. And they still use the alphabet nomenclature for the houses, but it was completely unrelated to the ones in Oak Ridge. They still needed places to shop. It was this very, very much the kind of Western town, almost like what you see in the classic Western movies. But here, Sears Roebuck moved in one of those kind of ramshackle houses. And even at the construction camp, for those workers that were housed in much more military-like environments, there was a sense of a need for community and entertainment, et cetera. This auditorium was built in 2 weeks. So now, familiar to all of you, again, I'm going to spend less time on this. I know you've had lengthy lectures about the history of many of the buildings in Los Alamos. You've had events going on this week. But I want to touch on a few things. Obviously, the great distinction here was you had this. Of the 3 sites, there was a history here in the form of the Los Alamos Ranch School. And again, somewhat surprisingly, that to the extent to which I've known people in the military and known attitudes about military planning and building, it tends to be very like, we know how to do this, we're gonna clear everything out, we're gonna build our thing. So I do think it was somewhat extraordinary that they came here and said, we can use this. This is a perfectly sturdy building. The big house, all this stuff, the bathtub row, leaving those houses available for the more senior scientists, et cetera, and rather than actually tearing them down, I think did say something about a recognition of the need for quality in a different way than what you had in Oak Ridge and Hanford and Richland. Great aerial view. This particular photo, I believe, was taken in 1946. So you see that this was much more of a workaday kind of environment. This was, was the smallest of the 3, of course. Here was the real nitty-gritty, the people trying to figure out how to make a bomb rather than creating fuel for the bomb. And so report after report said that this was the more, of the 3 communities, at least during the war, was the most traditionally military encampment. And but still, there was, there were attempts to create some very decent housing centered around Ashley Pond. I remember the confusion early in my days figuring out that was a person and a pond. But here we see, some of the housing was much more rudimentary. On average, people here were living in much more typically military environments. Here we see the Quonset huts, but look at all the infrastructure for all of the wiring and so on that was needed to feed that community. Here we had some of the manufactured housing, in this case an expansible trailer with the extensions on the side. You may note, though, the street sign. That's Central Avenue. That's right out there. So it wasn't quite what it is nowadays. And again, they had some of the more truly prefabricated houses, like the flat tops in Oak Ridge. In this case, they were known as the McKees. There was a collection of these that became known as McKeeville. But again, I go back to this notion that the people who took the time with this very rudimentary housing to put up the classic American white picket fence, that desire to create a sense of hominess and community was there all along. And in Oak Ridge, they had the rhythm engineers. Here you had the Keynotes at Theater Number 2, a multi-use space that was available for religious functions, for community performances, et cetera. So I remember very clearly when I came across this image during my research, because for me, this kind of congealed a lot of what was going on. This is from 1943. The war was raging. I mean, we'd had Midway, but there was still, no one knew how long this was going to last. And this was the Revere Copper Company with this notion that after total war can come total living. There's an opportunity here that through the technological progress we've made for the war, what we've learned about building communities quickly, efficiently, and cheaply, that can influence how we conceive of our nation and of our communities after the war. And I have a quote I wanted to read here from an architect named Joseph Allen Stein. War housing can be an example of our war aims. The new housing can raise the morale of workers and be a constant reminder of the meaning and purpose of democracy. And that came up time and time again, the extent to which people involved in all of these design for these cities felt that they were creating a future for our country, not just something that was going to last for the duration of the war. So in fact, after the war is where, in many cases, things kind of got even more interesting in terms of architecture and planning. I love the story from at least a couple of sources that on August 7th, 1945, a passenger train pulled into the Knoxville Central train station, and a porter came through one of the cars and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Knoxville, gateway to Oak Ridge," a city that had not existed officially until the day before. But at that point, word was out. President Truman had announced this ferocious new weapon and explained to people what had been going on in all of these secret cities that, let's face it, people knew they were there. Tremendous amounts of material were coming into all these communities, and nothing was coming out until it blew up. And so people knew something was going on, but they actually managed to keep their mouths shut by and large. But I do want to go back. So now, under the auspices of the Atomic Energy Commission, SOM was still retained to continue to oversee the development of Oak Ridge and really turn it into a permanent community. At this point, there were already rumblings of the Cold War, and then with the Soviet H-bomb test coming the following year, all of these cities took on new importance. And so Oak Ridge, SOM rather, went back to some of the original design ideas and really started to turn those, to massage those, and really create a more permanent community that would be expanding on the principles that they had explored early on. And now, when the situation was less critical and less immediate, they were able to explore some much more avant-garde design. These were some post-war housing examples in Oak Ridge, again, freshly after they were finished, not much landscaping here, but with the wood siding, and it's hard to tell here, but they're all sort of combined together. These are essentially row house type units in a way, but with shared, or rather terraces here, carports underneath, really kind of anticipating some of the California modern style that became the quintessential idea of the American good life in the 1950s and 60s. Here it was in 1948 in Oak Ridge. And at the same time, SOM was doing proposals for individual houses in Oak Ridge. In this case, another flat roof version, but very sleek, very modern, picking up on all the kind of modern tropes there, the long skinny windows, the interesting geometrical composition. In this case, with pitched roof, much more woodsy sort of approach with a great open deck out in front, all of which I think we would expect to see coming up down the pike later on in Los Angeles in particular. At the same time, they were continuing to design other aspects of the community, including the high school. This was the original wing of the Oak Ridge High School, the one that was built after the war. There was one built during the war that was more rudimentary. And at this point, SOM was brought in to help design the curriculum of the school. So the architecture firm that used to be doing the cool pavilions and doing the little houses, and then was figuring out 0.00625 barber chairs per person or whatever it was, literally doing it to that kind of calculation, they're now designing the academic curriculum for the school system. So that idea of the architect's work continued to expand. And also in Hanford, Richland, and even Los Alamos, after the war, there were new opportunities there to kind of rethink housing. And so some of you may be familiar with the Western area, where this was W.C. Kruger and Company, the equivalent company to SOM in Oak Ridge and Albin Pearson in Hanford/Richland. W.C. Kruger went on to design, among other buildings, the New Mexico State Capitol. But during the war and slightly after the war, they were doing a number of proposals for housing and other buildings, and really in this case trying to develop a kind of a neo-vernacular style, picking up on the Pueblo style. So something that was clearly very modern, very efficient, and something that could be built very quickly, but something that picked up on the local culture. And again, preserving those huge trees, now that they were, maybe less surprising now, post-war. And as for the influence of all of this, it's not speculation. It is interesting that the kind of revolution of prefabrication never really took off. That's a whole other lecture. I have my theories on why that was not the case. But there was a direct impact of some of the procedures and ways of going about designing and building from the secret cities that really struck a chord. Engineering News Record, a very prestigious magazine, very widely read, they had an entire feature on Oak Ridge's schools after the war. Other magazines were going crazy. Throughout the architecture profession, people were astonished at what happened during the war, and they couldn't believe the quality. You see time after time the critics going back and saying, this is an outstanding project. How did they do this under these circumstances? And what can we learn from all of this? And so William Levitt, the famous developer of the various Levitt towns, this one in New York, he was not prepared to go into full prefabrication, but he directly learned from the kind of phasing strategies that SOM employed to develop and turn out those houses in the Semesto neighborhood so quickly. If you remember, one every 30 minutes. And that's how he was able to build his now much critiqued cookie cutter suburbs using that similar kind of level of efficiency of building, bringing in one trade, working on 5 houses, they move on to the next 5, the next trade comes in, works on that, they keep moving on, almost a virtual assembly line, but where the product doesn't move, the people do. It also directly influenced the design of some of the idealized communities, the model communities that were very popular in the 60s and 70s. Reston, Virginia, outside of Washington, D.C., a famous one. The developer here also specifically referenced Oak Ridge and Richland in terms of their nodular planning, creating these communities that were self-sufficient but were still tied into the larger metropolitan area. So that had a significant impact as well. But in particular, I think one of the most fascinating things to come out of this was nothing less than a revolution in how we think of architectural practice, engineering practice, what all of these design-related trades involve. As I mentioned, SOM going into the war had between 60 and 90 people. By the end of the war, the firm had 650 employees in one office. And I wasn't able to determine how many were in the other offices, but this was a huge mega firm which never existed before. And this was now a firm that was prepared to do architecture, engineering, landscape architecture, all these kinds of things under one roof. Many of the most famous buildings that SOM has gone on to do were as famous for their engineering as for their architecture. In this case, one of the famous buildings, Lever House in New York. It's easy now to look at this and say, what's the big deal? A zillion of these got built. Well, by 1952, this was still revolutionary. And they were taking all the things they'd learned in the design and building of these communities and applying it now to a specific building, which I still think is quite beautiful in its elegant minimalism. The vertical tower and then the slab, the base here with the courtyard cut out from it, it really is still something that stands out from the masses of all of the similar curtain wall buildings in the country. And they also took that expertise in campus planning, creating whole communities. In this case, not a residential community, well, partially so, but the United States Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs with the sublime chapel it left. If you've never seen images of that inside, it's quite unbelievable. But a very rationalist, modern plan, but with these moments of excitement, now able to create these landmark buildings that really help to define the practice. And it is, I think, I would say inarguably, SOM has gone on to be the single most influential large architecture firm in the entire world in post-war history. They have won the American Institute of Architects Firm Award twice. Nobody gets to do that. They've continued to innovate. They are now very much at the forefront of sustainable design and all sorts of things at a variety of scales. In my last slide, I end up with an image of a project they're working on now in Toronto, Canada. This is a redo of an existing airfield, an airport that's now abandoned. And they're proposing, now again going back to, at a much larger scale, Toronto of course is a very dense city, you've got skyscrapers in there as well, but their language about this project to me evokes the language they used when talking about Oak Ridge 75, whatever it was, 75, 80 years ago, in talking about building community, not just creating houses, not just creating streets and figuring out where everything needs to go to get water to buildings and so on, but creating a community. And that now, I think, is a fair assessment of what architects are all striving to achieve on a daily basis. Thank you very much.
Anybody have questions? We'll do a few questions, and then we're happy to chat in the foyer after. So, any questions?
I've exhausted you all. I've exhausted my voice.
Yes, yeah.
I noticed I think it was the apartment buildings at Oak Ridge. The layout of that almost looks like some current buildings at Hickam Air Force Base.
Oh, interesting. I don't know those specifically.
The spacing and everything.
Yeah. Kind of maybe the angled elements in that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, definitely had an influence. The Army learned from this, and not just the Army, but the military in general. And, still, I think it's fair to say that a typical military barrack is not exactly the Ritz-Carlton, but, they learned from the need to provide adequate space, adequate facilities. All of that definitely showed up in the fascinating report that of General Groves, now it can be told, and all of the documentations, thousands of pages going through everything that was learned. They talk a lot about the architecture and engineering and planning as well as about building a bomb. And that was codified definitely as something that we learned from stuff. We should not forget this. This should work its way into future projects that we create. Yes?
I was wondering if you could speak to what changed in the last 80 years in terms of individuality, quality, buildings, and community to what we see in a lot of modern American construction with raise the ground, build the same house, 3 floor plans.
Yeah.
And that's it. What changed?
Not to put too fine a point on it, developers.
Okay.
The scale of development and the scale of money, the whole financing structure around development. I often talk to people. I find myself, not by design, but I've often been in a position of kind of defending modernism from in a situation where I might be on a panel discussion and people are talking, I miss the old buildings, and say, okay, there are a lot of things going on here, but one of the things that you'll often talk about indirectly is the texture of a city or a community that often involved a lot of smaller pieces. That is now almost impossible to conceive in any new development project because everything needs to be done at scale. The developers make more money the bigger the scale. And so you take a city, you tear down 10 buildings, and you put up 1. You take another community, you tear down 20 buildings, and you put up 1. So the buildings are larger. Some skilled architects have ways of kind of breaking up the apparent scale of that. And there really are some great buildings that have been done under those circumstances. But developers are now driving a focus on profit in a way that was just not the same. It simply wasn't 3/4 of a century ago. For that matter, even in terms of Lever House, that was very much, along with some of the other projects of that era, that was a corporation saying, we want a building that is part of our corporate identity. We want people to look at this and to say, this speaks to the I loved, and I can't remember the last time I walked through there, but in this very sleek skyscraper, on the second floor where they have some of their offices, someone had set up on a corner office a display of just on the shelf or on the sill all of the Lever Brothers products. I mean, it was very much tied into corporate culture. And now a lot of that is there's still some of that. Apple's headquarters, the great Ring, Google, it's now kind of in the tech realm where they're spending unbelievable amounts of money to have these very corporate identified things. But more typically, you're finding developers doing speculative office buildings, and people will move in, and there's not much unique character of that. They're building for profit in a way that was simply not the case before, and that profit can be maximized now in the digital era with people who can calculate. So, you do this, you don't spend an additional dollar you need to do here, it won't bring you any return. And I think that's, in a nutshell, that's the primary change, and that's what I think it's the reason why a lot of people are dissatisfied with newer communities.
Any other questions? Oh, we got a question here. Yeah, go for it.
Throw another one out. What's the relationship between the layout of the secret cities and what you outlined here and the development of the retirement communities? It started, in about the 1950s, the Sun Cities with Del Webb,
Right.
for example. That's a planned community.
Yeah.
Different goal, but...
I can't say, I haven't thought about that explicitly, but I'm sure there's been some influence. Because, again, a lot of that, thinking of my late in-laws' retirement community, which was very, we used to joke about it in a way that the closer you got to your end days, the closer you got to the middle, and the buildings were always in, because it was sort of a, it wasn't so perfect a geometrical form, but you had still single-family houses or duplexes where there was independent living. Then you needed a little bit more help, and you moved into some multifamily, and then you ultimately got into assisted care, and that was right in the center. And so there was very much a thoughtful planning to that, and I would think that most of those have learned. In particular with retirement communities, obviously there's going to be a concern about mobility. It's a thing that to me is one of the ironies of a lot of American development. If you talk to people, many Americans, about where do you like to vacation? Oh, we love Europe. We go to Europe. Or we go to Disney. Where are they going? They're going to places that are walkable. They're going to places that have density. And then they come back and they say, well, no, here we live in our little suburban. And, I grew up in a suburban house. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's funny to me that I think a lot of people would like a kind of community that they're not really asking for. They're just kind of taking what comes to them. And so you can imagine how advantageous it might be in a retirement community to have places and designs that actually encourage people to get out and walk. Having lived in Italy a couple of times, I'm astonished to see the little nonnas, the 98,000 years old, who are climbing 2,000-year-old steps and going down, and they do it every single day, and maybe that's why they're 98,000 years old. So, I think that there's some irony in how the assumptions we make about our communities versus what we might actually want.
There was one other consideration, because I went to the Sun City Museum, which was one of the original houses, the showcase houses, and they had built it for what you could afford with your new Social Security payment, right? Because that was new too.
Right, yeah.
And $800 or whatever, you could now buy this house, about 800 square feet, and then it was a walking community.
Yeah.
They envisioned no cars, just park your car in the central area and then walk everywhere. But that was another stipulation, was you could afford to live there on your Social Security payment.
Yeah.
So,
And again, I'm sure I need not telling you anything you don't know, that the price of housing has just gone crazy, and you can have my theories on that, and friends who are political economists who have their theories. It's a real challenge, and it's, there are a variety of factors there. Finance expectations is also part of it. Not to get too far afield, but not long ago, I came across on YouTube a series of home movies that had now been digitized they were by the actor Roddy McDowall, if you remember him, and he would have these incredible parties at his Malibu beachfront house where everybody, Lauren Bacall, Elizabeth Taylor, everybody, all those big names, and then you see in the background the house, which frankly looks kind of like some of those things you see in these modest communities in Oak Ridge or Richland. It was not elaborate. And now there's this expectation, if you've seen Beyonce's house, it's like a museum. I mean, it's 100,000 square feet. So that's obviously an extreme of celebrities and so on, but I think also just among the general public, there are now different expectations about how big your house needs to be, all those kinds of things that have just changed. I mean, I know when my parents were growing up, the idea of a 1,000 square foot house would have been generous. And now that's, hard to imagine for most Americans.
great, thank you.
Sure.
I think we have time for one more question, if there's any others. Okay, well, that's great. Let's go mingle in the back. So thank you all. And I just want to briefly plug again, you can go out there and scan the QR code, but you can visit our website at losalamospreservation.com. Information about the plan is there, the questionnaire is there, and please come and chat with me or Megan, who's in the back. And we will have more to come as we move forward to the end of the year with this process. So keep an eye out. So thank you so much.